Hello, my name is Owen. Today I'll be doing a quick review of Fredrik Backman's Us Against You. What I want to do is give a brief overview of what the book's about and tell you things that I liked and tell you things that I didn't like. Jumping straight into it, this is the sequel to Fredrik Backman's Bear Town. It takes place in a hockey town in Sweden. And this book follows the rivalry between the two towns, Bear Town and Head. They have like a hockey rivalry and just like an overall town rivalry. Like both the economies are struggling, stuff like that. So they're both fighting for jobs against each other. Like there's a big hockey game coming up. A lot of drama, very intense, very similar to the first book. But that's the general overview. In terms of should you read the first one before it, it's not completely necessary, I would say. The author does a good job of like reintroducing all the characters and kind of telling the story of the first book in like a quick summary way, if you hadn't read the first one in a long time, or maybe you accidentally stumbled into this book. So I think it's completely reasonable that you start with this book. However, I think if you want like a truly like deeper sense of the characters, like from the beginning, definitely check out the first book. I really liked it, and my review is on the channel of it. So going straight into it, my thoughts about it. I did like this book. I really enjoyed it. However, not as much as the first one, and I'll get into more specific details as to why. Really, I mean, like when I was reading this book, I was addressing the issue of necessary sequels, and I'll save those thoughts for a little bit down the road. But going into things that I liked, Backman, as usual, is such a great wordsmith of crafting emotion. And like having you sympathize with their characters. I already loved most of these characters from the first book, and some of the characters from the first book are outside of the story. They're done, their story's done, which I appreciated. And then some of the other characters that were main characters in the first book are main characters again, and also he takes a focus on some of the characters that were more secondary. And I thought it all worked very well. Some of the main characters for this book is Benji, who was a pretty big character in the last book, who I absolutely love. Maya, who was a very big character in the first one. And then some of the new ones are like Ramona, the bar owner, gets a little bit more screen time. And then Leo, Maya's younger brother, gets a little more screen time as well. Overall, very well written, super emotional, very powerful, a lot of like deep quotes about like what is hate and what is sports and the meaning of it and like what it truly means for people and why people get so invested in it. And just about like humanity and like human nature. The first one dealt with like how a community deals with allegations of like rape. They were true, but how does a town react to that news, especially when it's against somebody who they think is a hero for the town, which I thought was a very interesting topic. And this one deals more with like I said before, like the inner conflicts between towns and how they react against each other and how they make villains of each other and stuff like that, and as well as like how they villainize people that don't seem to fit in with them. I will say, going into things that I didn't like, this was an unnecessary sequel, and I think what makes the difference between a necessary sequel and unnecessary sequel is if there is character arcs that need to be finished, if there is something that needs to be explored further, I think a sequel is necessary. A lot of fantasy books obviously are multi-series because like the author wants to tell a larger story. However, Bear Town was a very close-ended story, at least I felt. There was the conflict, and then there was the resolution, and then it ended in a way that it could have been the only book in the series. Could very easily have been standalone. And while I do think like this is a good book, like the plot, I don't see anything wrong with it. And also like going back to things that I liked, Backman does a really good job at keeping things concise. It's a very, not dense, but tightly packed story. So like obviously there's hockey games, and some authors would do like 20-30 pages of the hockey game, like he skated left, he skated right, which happened like a little bit more in the first book. But this one just like the one team scored, and they scored again, and they scored again, and they scored again, and then they lost. And it was like the huge game that they were like building up towards, or that was like an example. That's not what actually happened, or maybe it was. But yeah, so it's just like the build up and stuff like that. Or like if you're building up to a big fight, like these characters, like you think it's going to be like a big dramatic fight. It's going to, no, he went in there, he punched him in the face, he was knocked out. That was the end of the fight. So he does a lot of like build up and like quickly evaporates, which actually like some people might find that like anticlimactic. But I actually found it very refreshing because it kept the story like going and going and going. And at the beginning of this book, they're obviously building up to like the big game between this town and this town. And at first I thought it was going to be like a longer timeline, but no, it was just like the lead up to the game, the lead up to the game, the lead up to the game. The game happened so quickly, and then I realized like, oh, that's actually not what the book is about. And I was meant to think that it was about this thing because everybody in the town thought it was the most important thing, but it's not the most important thing, which is a great metaphor. But the reason I got a little off track there, the reason I think it's an unnecessary sequel is because it kind of treads similar grounds as the first one in terms of like, so the first book was kind of like, oh, you think it's a sports book about a rivalry or about a hockey team rather, and then something takes a dark turn, and then it's about rape, it's about not believing the victim, it's about like how women are treated in society, and it's a lot deeper than you ever thought, a lot darker than you thought, and then it's just the consequences of that, which I really, really enjoyed. I thought it was super unique. This one starts off, because we already know this is the brutal world, so it starts there. Our characters are constantly getting beaten down, the worst things are happening to our favorite characters constantly, but it still ends on a positive note, like the first book did. And I just felt like, I think it worked better when we were faced with the realities of humanity, if that makes sense, rather than just like living it, because it was just mostly like depressing for depressing's sake, I felt like. And the fact that it ended the same way the first book ended, it just felt very familiar and not in like, this one didn't move me as much because like it was just sad events happening to people, and I'm not going to be completely unfair to it because I think like Benji had a great character arc. I didn't necessarily think that he needed to be explored more after the first book, but his arc in this book is super awesome, and I loved it. And some of the new characters as well, I really liked and enjoyed. I just don't think it was necessary. And the thing that scares me is I know the third book is coming out like in a week, like super soon. Like I checked it today, and I just think that I can't imagine that it could be worth it, because how much can you explore this idea of hockey and how much it means to people, and how people like put too much meaning into it, but also like not enough meaning into it. It just feels a little overexplored. But like I said, it's not a bad written book, and I did read it pretty fast, and I did enjoy it. It was just unnecessary, right? So it was the first time I ever read a book where I was like, this book has no reason to exist, but it's still good, so it's fine, which is interesting. And take that with what you will. So I feel like if you read Beartown and you don't feel like reading it, but you wonder like, oh, I'm missing out on something, you're not really, but it's a good book, and I enjoyed it. So where does that leave you with a recommendation? It's a great question. I have no idea. I will be reading the third book because I do like these characters. I am invested in their lives, but I hope that Backman takes a little bit of a different approach, where he's not just like constantly beating up the characters until the last 50 pages where it's like, oh, but then they learned and then they grew as people. So that's what I got for you. Thank you.